Some people believe the greatest miracles happen when a broken person meets someone even more broken. But the truth is far more painful, because sometimes the person who saves your life never realizes they were the one being rescued. The first snow of December drifted quietly across the streets of Manhattan as Naomi Carter stood outside a towering iron gate with a thin winter coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders and an envelope clutched against her chest. Inside that envelope was the last chance she had left. 3 months earlier, she had been working double shifts at a small assisted living home in Brooklyn, taking care of elderly residents who treated her like family, but the building had closed without warning, leaving dozens unemployed. Since then, every interview had ended with the same polite smile and the same empty promise that someone would call her back. No one ever did. Rent notices had begun appearing beneath her apartment door like unwelcome visitors, and the little savings she had built over years of careful living had disappeared faster than she thought possible. The old apartment above the laundromat had never been much to look at, but it was filled with memories of her mother, whose favorite rocking chair still sat beside the window, facing the city lights. Naomi could never bring herself to sell it, even when the landlord reminded her that memories did not pay bills. 2 nights before, she had sat in that chair holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold when her phone rang. A quiet woman introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, Director of Household Operations for the Whitmore estate. She explained that the family was searching for a private caregiver. The pay was more money than Naomi had ever imagined earning. The position included housing and meals. There was only one condition. The patient was Ethan Whitmore. Even people who never followed business news knew his name. The billionaire founder of one of the country's largest technology companies had vanished from public life after a tragic accident nearly 2 years ago. Rumors filled the internet. Some claimed he had become cruel. Others said he refused to speak to anyone. One article called him the ghost of Fifth Avenue. When Naomi arrived at the employment agency to sign the paperwork, the receptionist looked at her with something that almost resembled pity. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. "You're the 12th caregiver they've hired. Nobody lasts more than a week." Naomi had smiled politely because she had learned long ago that fear never put food on the table. The black sedan that picked her up from the city carried her through streets lined with Christmas lights until the buildings gave way to a private road surrounded by ancient oak trees. At the end of it stood the Whitmore estate, a stone mansion so enormous it looked less like a home and more like a forgotten castle. Warm golden lights glowed behind the windows, but somehow the place still felt lonely. The driver opened the door and offered his hand. "Good luck, Miss Carter," he said softly. She stepped onto the gravel path and looked up at the massive front entrance. Somewhere behind those walls was a man who had everything money could buy and yet wanted nothing the world had left to offer. Somewhere behind those walls was the answer to whether she would keep her home or lose the last piece of her old life. The giant wooden doors opened before she could knock. An older woman with silver hair stood waiting, her expression kind but tired. "You must be Naomi. Thank you for coming." Naomi nodded and followed her through hallways lined with priceless paintings and silent crystal chandeliers. The mansion was beautiful, but it felt as though no one had laughed there for years. As they reached the end of a long corridor, Margaret stopped beside a closed door. She hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Whitmore does not like visitors. He does not like questions. Most of all, he does not like kindness." Naomi looked at the door for a long moment. Then she tightened her grip on the small photograph of her mother tucked inside her coat pocket. "My mother used to say that the loneliest people are the ones who pretend they don't need anybody." Margaret studied her face, and for the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared. She reached for the handle and whispered, "I hope you're right." Slowly the door opened, and Naomi took the first step toward the man who would change her life forever. The room was larger than Naomi expected, but it did not feel grand. The fireplace burned quietly against the far wall, filling the space with a soft amber glow, yet the warmth never seemed to reach the man sitting beside the window. Ethan Whitmore faced the snow-covered gardens with his wheelchair turned slightly away from the door, his hands resting motionless on a dark wool blanket across his lap. The photographs she had seen online had never captured the quiet sadness that surrounded him. He looked younger than she imagined, perhaps no older than his late 30s, with neatly combed brown hair and the kind of face that once belonged on magazine covers before life had stolen something invisible from behind his eyes. Margaret cleared her throat gently. Mr. Whitmore, your new caregiver has arrived. He did not turn around. I thought I made myself clear, he said in a calm voice that somehow felt colder than the winter outside. I do not need another caregiver. Margaret glanced at Naomi with an apologetic smile before quietly leaving the room. The heavy door closed behind them, and silence settled between two strangers from completely different worlds. Naomi stood still for a moment, remembering every warning she had heard during the past 24 hours. Do not argue with him. Do not take his words personally. Do not expect him to like you. She looked around the room instead. A bookshelf stretched from floor to ceiling. A grand piano sat untouched beneath a crystal chandelier. On a small table near the window rested a ceramic mug with cold coffee still inside. The surface had formed a thin skin from sitting there too long. Without saying anything, Naomi walked over, picked up the mug, and carried it toward the door. Stop. His voice was sharper this time. She turned slowly. Did I ask you to touch my things? No, sir, she answered softly. Then why are you doing it? Because cold coffee tastes lonely. For the first time since she entered the room, Ethan looked at her. His gray eyes studied her carefully, almost as though he were trying to understand why she had said something so unusual. People usually apologized to him. They tried to impress him or comfort him. This young woman simply held an old coffee cup and looked back at him without fear. You think you know something about loneliness? He asked. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the mug in her hands. My mother spent 8 years fighting an illness that slowly took away everything except her smile. Sometimes I would make her coffee in the morning, and when she was too tired to drink it, I would make another one. Not because she asked me to, because I wanted her to know someone was still there. Ethan said nothing. She carried the mug out of the room and returned a few minutes later with a fresh cup. Steam drifted gently into the air. She placed it on the table beside him and stepped back. I am not here to fix your life, Mr. Whitmore. I am just here to do my job. He stared at the coffee but did not touch it. Most people take one look at this chair and decide they need to save me, he finally said. Naomi looked toward the window where snowflakes floated quietly through the evening sky. My mother used to tell me that broken things are not waiting to be rescued. They are waiting for someone to stop looking away. Ethan turned back toward the garden, but something had changed. The silence between them no longer felt empty. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the old estate, covering every path in white. And for the first time in many months, a cup of coffee beside Ethan Whitmore slowly grew cold because he had forgotten to drink it. The next morning arrived wrapped in silver light as the first rays of the sun slipped through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. Naomi woke before everyone else, just as she always had when her mother was alive. Quiet mornings had taught her that hope often arrived before the rest of the world was ready to notice it. She walked through the silent kitchen and found the staff already preparing breakfast. A house that large needed dozens of people to keep it running. But somehow every voice seemed softer, every step more careful, as if the entire mansion was built around protecting one wounded soul from the noise of life. The head chef smiled politely when she entered. Mr. Whitmore never eats breakfast before 10, he said. Sometimes he does not eat at all. Naomi looked at the tray of fresh fruit, warm bread, and coffee. Then she noticed a small bowl of blueberries sitting near the sink. She remembered the untouched coffee from the night before and the way Ethan had stared out the window while snow covered the gardens. She pointed at the blueberries. Does he like those? The chef looked surprised. Every morning before the accident, he had them with oatmeal and honey. But he has not touched them in almost 2 years. Naomi placed a handful of berries into a small white bowl and carried it upstairs with a fresh cup of coffee. She knocked gently before entering. Ethan was already awake, sitting by the window in the same position as the evening before, watching cardinals gather around a stone fountain buried beneath the snow. She placed the tray beside him without saying a word. I did not ask for breakfast, he said quietly. I know, Naomi answered. The birds did not ask for winter either, but they still have to eat. Ethan looked toward the window again, and for a moment she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move ever so slightly. She pretended not to notice. Instead, she walked toward a dusty bookshelf in the corner of the room. Hundreds of books filled the shelves. Business, history, travel, music. One book had been left slightly out of place, its worn leather cover faded with age. Naomi pulled it free. It was a collection of American landscapes filled with photographs of mountains, forests, and quiet lakes. A picture of Yellowstone National Park caught her attention. My mother always wanted to go there. She whispered more to herself than anyone else. Ethan finally looked at her. Did she ever make it? Naomi shook her head. Life had other plans. The room grew quiet again. She carefully returned the book to the shelf, but something slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the carpet. It was an old photograph. A younger Ethan stood beside an elderly man near a fishing dock, both smiling beneath a bright summer sky. The older man held the same book in his hands. My grandfather, Ethan, said before she could ask. He taught me that the richest people are the ones who have time to sit by the water and do nothing at all. Naomi handed him the photograph. It is a beautiful memory. He looked down at the picture for a long moment. I have not looked at this since he passed away. She noticed a small crack running across the wooden frame around the photograph. Without asking permission, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and took out a tiny tube of clear glue she always carried for small repairs. Her mother had called it the fix-anything kit. A loose button, a broken picture frame, a torn page. Naomi carefully repaired the crack and placed the photograph back on the table beside him. There, she said softly. Some things deserve another chance. Ethan stared at the frame, then at the bowl of blueberries beside it. Slowly, almost uncertainly, he reached for a spoon. Downstairs, Margaret watched from the hallway through the half-open door. She had worked for the Whitmore family for more than 20 years, and tears quietly filled her eyes. 11 caregivers had come and gone. They had brought medicine, schedules, and instructions. But this young woman had brought something none of them ever thought to carry into that lonely room. She had brought home. The days passed with the quiet rhythm of falling snow, and little by little the great house began to change in ways that no one could quite explain. The staff noticed that the curtains in Mr. Whitmore's room were opened every morning now, allowing sunlight to spill across the polished hardwood floors. The untouched piano was dusted. Fresh flowers appeared on the table beside the window. None of it happened because Ethan asked for it. Naomi simply believed that a room should never forget that life was still happening outside its walls. One afternoon, while a pale winter sun rested over the gardens, she found him staring at the frozen fountain again. The small flock of cardinals had returned, their bright red feathers standing out against the white snow like tiny sparks of hope. They come every day, she said softly. Ethan did not look away from the window. They are looking for food. Or maybe they are looking for each other. He let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. You always have an answer for everything. Naomi shook her head. No, I just think the world feels less lonely when you imagine good reasons instead of bad ones. Silence settled between them again, but it was no longer uncomfortable. She picked up the old landscape book from the shelf and opened it to a page showing a wooden cabin beside a lake in Montana. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains like a mirror. Have you ever been there? She asked. Ethan nodded once. My grandfather took me fishing there every summer until I was 16. He told me that successful people spend their lives buying things, but wise people spend their lives collecting moments. Naomi smiled as she looked at the photograph. He sounds like a wonderful man. He was, Ethan answered quietly. He was the only person who never cared how much money I would make. He only cared whether I remembered to watch sunsets. Naomi closed the book carefully. My mother used to say something like that. She believed that people carry little pieces of love with them forever. A favorite song, a recipe, a photograph. That is how the people we lose stay close. Ethan finally turned his chair toward her. You talk about her like she is still here. Naomi looked toward the fireplace where the flames danced softly behind the glass screen. Sometimes I think she is. Every morning when I make coffee, I still hear her telling me not to rush. Every time I fix something broken, I remember her saying that almost everything deserves a second chance. Ethan lowered his eyes to the old photograph of his grandfather resting on the table. His fingers brushed gently across the repaired frame. Nobody ever fixed things after the accident, he said. They only replaced them. New nurses, new doctors, new therapists, new schedules. Everyone acted like the old version of me was already gone. Naomi stepped closer, stopping just beside the window. Maybe they were looking at the chair instead of the person sitting in it. The words hung quietly in the room. Outside, one of the cardinals landed on the edge of the frozen fountain, tilting its head toward the house as though it had come to listen. Ethan followed the little bird with his eyes. Then he asked a question no one in the mansion had heard him ask in nearly 2 years. Naomi, what was your mother like? She looked surprised for only a second before a gentle smile touched her face. She pulled a chair beside his window and sat down. Well, she loved old jazz records, terrible detective movies, and blueberry oatmeal every Sunday morning. Ethan glanced at the empty bowl still sitting on the table from breakfast, and for the first time since Naomi had arrived, the lonely room was filled not with silence, but with the quiet sound of two people sharing memories that neither of them wanted the world to forget. Winter settled gently over the Whitmore estate, covering the gardens in a blanket of white that seemed to soften every sharp edge the old mansion had carried for years. Naomi had been there almost 3 weeks now, longer than anyone expected. The staff no longer whispered about when she would leave. Instead, they quietly wondered how one ordinary young woman had managed to bring light back into a place that money had never been able to warm. Every evening after dinner, she would roll Ethan's wheelchair toward the sunroom at the back of the house where enormous windows overlooked the frozen lake beyond the property. They rarely spoke much. Sometimes they simply watched the sky change colors together as the last light faded behind the trees. Naomi believed silence did not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it meant two people had finally stopped pretending. One evening, as soft snow drifted against the glass, she noticed an old record player sitting forgotten in the corner beneath a white sheet. The edges of the cover were dusty, as though no one had touched it in years. She looked at Ethan. Does it still work? He followed her eyes and grew very still. I do not know. I have not played it since my grandfather died. Naomi walked over and carefully lifted the cloth away. The polished wood underneath still shined beneath the dust. Beside it sat a small stack of vinyl records. She gently picked one up and smiled when she read the label. Frank Sinatra. My mother loved him, she whispered. She used to dance around our apartment while she cleaned. Ethan watched as Naomi placed the record onto the turntable. A moment later, soft music floated through the room, warm and timeless, filling spaces that had forgotten what joy sounded like. Naomi closed her eyes for just a second, remembering a tiny apartment above a laundromat, her mother laughing with a broom in one hand and an old coffee mug in the other. When she opened them again, she saw something unexpected. Ethan was looking at her, not with sadness, not with anger, but with curiosity. Did you dance with her? He asked. Naomi laughed quietly. Every Sunday morning. She said nobody should start the day carrying yesterday's worries. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his hands. My grandfather used to make me dance with him in the kitchen. I hated it when I was 12. Naomi smiled. I bet you would give anything to have one more dance now. The room fell silent again, but this time Ethan nodded. I would. Naomi stepped closer and reached for the old photograph frame she had repaired days earlier. She placed it beside the record player. Maybe memories are not there to make us sad, she said softly. Maybe they are there to remind us that love does not disappear just because people do. Ethan looked out toward the frozen lake where the last golden light reflected across the snow. Then, almost as if he had forgotten to protect himself, he spoke words no one else had heard since the accident. I used to think my life ended that day. Naomi sat down in the chair beside him. And now, he looked at the photograph, the record player, the coffee resting on the small table, and the snow falling quietly beyond the windows. Now I am not so sure. At that exact moment, Margaret walked past the open doorway carrying fresh linens. She stopped without making a sound. Inside the sunroom, the billionaire who had locked himself away from the world was listening to music again. The young woman who had arrived with nothing but an old photograph and a pocket full of simple tools had done what doctors, consultants, and therapists never could. She had not tried to change Ethan Whitmore. She had simply reminded him who he had been before the world convinced him he was broken. The following week brought a strange kind of peace to the Whitmore estate. The snow had stopped falling, and the frozen lake beyond the sunroom reflected the pale winter sky like polished glass. Naomi had settled into a quiet routine. Every morning she opened the curtains, made fresh coffee, and placed a small bowl of blueberries beside Ethan without asking whether he wanted them. Every evening they listened to old records while the fireplace painted soft golden light across the room. Nobody spoke about the changes, but everyone noticed them. The gardeners saw Ethan watching them through the windows instead of keeping the curtains closed. The kitchen staff smiled when empty breakfast dishes came back downstairs. Even Margaret seemed lighter, as though she had been carrying a burden for years and had finally found someone willing to help her hold it. One afternoon, while Ethan rested in the library, Naomi decided to organize a cabinet filled with old family albums and loose papers. The shelves had collected years of dust, and she thought his grandfather would have hated seeing memories forgotten that way. She carefully stacked faded photographs and tied old letters together with a ribbon she found in a drawer. As she reached toward the back of the cabinet, a thin leather folder slipped free and landed softly on the floor. It had no label. Only a silver clasp held it shut. Naomi hesitated. She had never touched anything that felt private before. But the folder had fallen open on its own, revealing a newspaper clipping tucked inside. Across the top, in bold black letters, she read the words, "Young tech billionaire injured saving child during highway crash." Her breath caught. She had seen stories about Ethan's accident before, but never this one. Beneath the headline was a photograph taken years earlier. The image was grainy, yet she could clearly see Ethan sitting on the ground beside an ambulance, his face turned away from the cameras. In his arms, he was holding a little boy wrapped in a blanket. Naomi stared at the picture. Something about it felt strangely familiar. Before she could understand why, another piece of paper slipped from the folder. It was a handwritten note. The edges had yellowed with time. The writing was elegant but uneven, as though it had been written by someone exhausted. It read, "If the child survives, do not ever tell him who pulled him from the car. Ethan would never want a family to carry that weight." Naomi read the sentence again. Her fingers trembled slightly. She looked back at the photograph. The little boy's face was partly hidden beneath the blanket, but around his tiny wrist was a woven blue bracelet with a single silver bead. Her heart seemed to stop. She knew that bracelet. She had made it herself 20 years ago for her younger brother, Caleb, before their mother took them on a short trip outside the city. He had worn it every single day because he believed it was lucky. Naomi slowly sat down on the floor, the old folder resting in her lap. She remembered the terrible phone call, the icy roads, the accident that had taken her little brother from her forever. She remembered her mother crying quietly by the hospital window and telling her that a stranger had tried to save him, a stranger whose name they never learned. Footsteps echoed softly behind her. Naomi quickly wiped the tears from her eyes and closed the folder. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her with gentle confusion. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at him, then at the old leather folder she held against her chest. For the first time since she entered the Whitmore estate, she did not know what to say, because the man who believed she had come there to save him might have been the same man who had once tried to save the little brother she had never stopped missing. Naomi hardly slept that night. The old leather folder remained hidden inside the bottom drawer of her bedroom, wrapped carefully beneath a folded sweater as though covering it could somehow quiet the storm inside her heart. She sat beside the small window overlooking the frozen gardens, watching moonlight spread across the snow, and thought about her little brother. Caleb had been only 7 years old. He laughed too loudly during cartoons, collected smooth stones from playgrounds, and believed every stray dog in the world was secretly waiting for him to become its best friend. Her mother used to say that he carried sunshine inside him. The accident had taken that sunshine away from both of them. For 20 years, Naomi had imagined the stranger who had tried to save him. She had pictured an ordinary man, perhaps a father, perhaps a truck driver passing by, someone whose name had disappeared into time. She had never imagined that the stranger would become the lonely man sitting beside the library window every morning, quietly eating blueberries while pretending not to care if she stayed or left. The following day, she found Ethan exactly where she expected him to be. A light snowfall had started again, and he was watching tiny flakes drift across the lake beyond the sunroom. Naomi carried his coffee to the table and placed it beside him. He noticed the sadness in her eyes immediately. "Something is different," he said softly. She forced a small smile. "Just tired." He studied her for another moment. "You are not very good at pretending." Naomi looked away toward the falling snow. "Neither are you." A quiet silence settled between them. The old record player spun slowly in the corner, filling the room with gentle piano music. Ethan reached for the repaired photograph of his grandfather and held it in his hands. "There was a time," he said quietly, "when I thought saving people could fix everything." Naomi felt her heart begin to race. She lowered herself into the chair beside him. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked through the window instead of at her. Before the accident, I spent every second chasing success. Meetings, flights, contracts. I thought building companies would make life meaningful. Then one winter evening, I was driving back from a charity event when I saw a car slide across an icy road. It happened so fast. He stopped speaking. His fingers tightened slightly around the old photograph. Naomi listened without moving. There was a family inside, he continued. I remember a little boy wearing a blue bracelet. He looked scared, but he was holding onto a toy truck like it was the only thing keeping him brave. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, I got him out before help arrived. I remember carrying him through the snow. Then everything else became a blur. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me the boy did not make it. Naomi felt tears gathering before she could stop them. Ethan looked down at the floor. I spent years wondering if I should have reached him sooner. If I had been faster, stronger, maybe things would have been different. Naomi wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to say that little boy had been Caleb, that her family had prayed for the stranger who tried to save him, that her mother had whispered blessings for a man they would never know. But the words would not come. Instead, she slowly reached over and placed her hand on top of the old photograph in his lap. My mother used to say that love is measured by what we are willing to carry for someone else. Ethan looked at her, confused. Naomi blinked away the tears and smiled softly through them. I think that little boy would have wanted you to stop carrying this one alone. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the frozen lake, covering old footprints until they disappeared, but inside the quiet sunroom, two hearts sat side by side, each holding a secret the other did not yet understand. The days that followed felt different to Naomi, as though the old mansion itself had begun holding its breath. She carried the truth inside her like a small, fragile flame, afraid that if she spoke too soon it would disappear forever. Every time she looked at Ethan, she no longer saw only the quiet billionaire who had hidden himself from the world. She saw the young man standing beside an ambulance in the snow, carrying a frightened little boy with a blue bracelet around his wrist. She saw the stranger her mother had prayed for every night until the day she died. Yet she also saw the sadness he had carried for 20 years, believing he had failed someone he had tried so desperately to save. One afternoon, the clouds finally broke, and sunlight poured across the frozen lake for the first time in weeks. Ethan asked Naomi to take him outside. The request surprised everyone. Margaret quickly found his heavy winter coat, while one of the groundskeepers cleared a narrow path through the snow. Naomi slowly pushed his wheelchair toward the old wooden gazebo near the water, the same place his grandfather had once loved to sit with a fishing pole and a cup of coffee. The air was cold, but the sky above them was perfectly clear. They sat together without speaking for several minutes, listening to the soft sound of wind moving through the bare trees. Ethan looked across the lake and smiled faintly. My grandfather used to tell me that winter was proof that the world trusted itself enough to bloom again. Naomi wrapped her hands around the warm cup of coffee she had brought for him. My mother believed almost the same thing. She used to say that God never leaves a tree bare forever. Ethan turned toward her. I wish I could have met her. Naomi felt her throat tighten. I think she would have liked you. He laughed quietly. I am not sure many people do. She shook her head. That is because they only see what happened to you. They never see who you were before. Ethan looked down at the blanket covering his legs. Sometimes I do not see him either. Naomi reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the little silver bead she had kept since childhood. It had broken away from Caleb's bracelet years before the accident, and she had carried it ever since. She rolled it gently between her fingers while looking at the lake. Do you believe people can save each other without knowing it? She asked softly. Ethan thought about the question. I think some people spend their whole lives doing exactly that. They leave behind kindness they never get to see grow. Naomi closed her hand around the bead. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she smiled anyway. Then maybe the world is not as lonely as we think. As the sun began to set, its golden light spread across the snow until the entire lake seemed to glow. Ethan watched the reflection quietly before speaking again. There is something I have never told anyone. After the accident, I hired investigators to find the family of that little boy. They searched for months, but every report came back empty. Eventually, I told them to stop, because I thought maybe they deserved a chance to move on without being reminded of that day. Naomi looked at him, her heart aching with tenderness. She realized that while she had spent 20 years thanking an unknown stranger, He had spent the same 20 years searching for a family. He believed he had failed. She slipped the tiny silver bead back into her pocket and looked toward the fading sunlight. Not every promise is meant to be broken, she whispered to herself. Some are simply waiting for the right moment to find their way home. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in the soft gold light of a late winter sunrise. Naomi woke before dawn and walked through the silent halls of the Whitmore estate with the little silver bead resting in the palm of her hand. She had carried it through childhood, through loss, through long nights wondering why life could be so cruel, and now it felt heavier than ever because she finally understood that grief had been living in two different hearts all along. She found Ethan in the sunroom before the staff had even begun preparing breakfast. He was watching the first birds return to the frozen fountain, just as he did every morning. A fresh cup of coffee waited beside him, untouched. Naomi stepped closer and placed the old leather folder gently onto the table. Ethan looked down at it, confused. "I thought I had put that away years ago," he said quietly. Naomi sat across from him. "Maybe some things find their way back when they are ready." He opened the folder slowly. The newspaper clipping was still there. The faded photograph. The handwritten note. His eyes stopped on the picture of the little boy wrapped in a blanket. "I never forgot his face," Ethan whispered. "Not for one day." Naomi reached into her pocket and placed the tiny silver bead beside the photograph. Ethan frowned for a moment before picking it up. His fingers trembled slightly. "I remember this," he said. "It fell into the snow when I carried him. I kept looking for it because he was crying for his bracelet." Naomi felt tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "My little brother made me promise never to throw it away if it ever broke." Ethan slowly looked up at her. The room seemed to grow completely still. The old record player in the corner had stopped spinning. Even the birds outside appeared motionless against the pale morning sky. Naomi took a slow breath. His name was Caleb. Ethan stared at her, unable to speak. She smiled through the tears. "The little boy you carried through the snow? He was my brother." The silver bead slipped gently from Ethan's fingers onto the table. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan lowered his head and closed his eyes. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "I tried. I wanted him to go home." Naomi reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You did." Ethan looked at her with quiet confusion. "My mother spent 20 years praying for the stranger who refused to leave him alone. She said that even though we lost Caleb, God sent someone to make sure he was not afraid. She never knew your name, but every Sunday morning she thanked you anyway." Ethan's eyes filled with tears he had hidden from the world for far too long. "I thought I failed him." Naomi gently shook her head. "No. You carried him when nobody else could. You gave my family something we never had before. We knew he was loved in his final moments." The winter sunlight slowly filled the room, warming the old photographs, the coffee cups, and the little silver bead resting between them. Ethan looked out toward the frozen lake where the first signs of spring were beginning to soften the ice. "After all these years," he said quietly, "I finally found the family I was looking for." Naomi smiled, remembering her mother's favorite words. Sometimes love takes the long way home. Outside, the cardinals returned to the fountain, bright against the melting snow, and inside the lonely old mansion, two broken stories finally became one, not because the past had changed, but because kindness had survived long enough to find its way back into the light.